Napoleon Bonaparte is one of history's most captivating figures, known for his military genius and his ability to bend armies and empires to his will. But there's one thing he couldn't control, something that eventually contributed to his undoing: the weather. Napoleon's campaigns were often defined by the timing of rainstorms, scorching heat waves, and bone-chilling winters. These forces of nature, unpredictable and unrelenting, repeatedly shaped his victories and defeats. Today, we look back at how weather played the unsung hero, or villain, in the epic saga of Napoleon's empire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Trust me, it's the least you can do for what's coming next. Napoleon's empire stretched across Europe, and with such vast land came an equally vast variety of weather. Each region he conquered brought a new set of challenges, and nature often threw the dice in his face, influencing his ability to march, fight, and survive. But it wasn't all bad news for the French emperor. In fact, historians still argue whether Napoleon's genius included the ability to harness weather patterns to his advantage. Was he a master tactician who understood the subtle intricacies of climate? Or was it sheer luck? The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. Take the year 1812, for instance. Napoleon, with his towering ambitions, had his eyes firmly set on Russia. But before he could storm Moscow and crush the Russian army, nature had other plans. The Russian winter, known for its punishing cold and unpredictable blizzards, set the stage for one of Napoleon's most infamous military campaigns. The frozen wasteland turned what was supposed to be a glorious triumph into a retreat of biblical proportions. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's decision to march into Russia was a matter of strategic brilliance or sheer folly. But one thing's for sure, that winter was a force to be reckoned with. The freezing temperatures didn't just kill soldiers, they shattered Napoleon's confidence, too. And while his soldiers froze to death, nature wasn't the only thing playing an enemy. Russian forces, experts at guerrilla warfare, harassed the retreating French army at every turn. So, with the icy winds at his back and a rapidly diminishing army, Napoleon's once invincible empire crumbled. But in a twisted sense of irony, that same weather that had nearly crushed him would also play a key role in his eventual comeback? Well, sort of. But that's a story for later. If Napoleon had learned anything from his misadventure in Russia, it was that nature was a force not to be ignored, no matter how brilliant your strategy. But let's rewind a bit before that fateful winter of 1812. Napoleon's campaign in Spain, which began in 1808, was not only plagued by a hostile population and guerrilla warfare but by another natural enemy, the oppressive summer heat. The Spanish summer is infamous for its unrelenting heat, and for Napoleon's troops, it was an enemy they couldn't escape. Historians still debate whether Napoleon underestimated the Spanish climate or if he simply couldn't have predicted how miserable the conditions would become. Either way, the sun beat down mercilessly on the French army. Imagine soldiers trudging across the Iberian Peninsula, weighed down by the stifling heat, their uniforms sticking to their bodies as they faced an enemy that wasn't just human. It was the sweltering, unforgiving Spanish summer. It was no surprise that morale plummeted and disease spread like wildfire, making the Spanish campaign one of Napoleon's most exhausting and, ultimately, frustrating wars. But the heat wasn't the only problem. As the French army found itself battling against the scorching sun, disease broke out. The combination of heat, lack of sanitation, and exposure to unfamiliar illnesses took a terrible toll. Some estimates say that Napoleon lost more men to disease than to combat during the Spanish campaign. And it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered, Napoleon's prestige took a hit, too. For all his battlefield prowess, he seemed unable to control the weather or the diseases it brought along. And those tiny inconveniences, like the heat, had a much bigger impact than many historians had anticipated. But wait, there's more. As the French marched through Spain, Napoleon's troops found themselves stuck in muddy, waterlogged fields during the rainy season. The summer heat had come and gone, but now they faced a new enemy, the unrelenting rain. This didn't just make things uncomfortable, it turned the battlefield into a quagmire that slowed the French advance to a crawl. The muck and mire of Spain became as deadly as any weapon the Spanish could throw at them. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's decision to push through the Spanish countryside was a strategic blunder or a victim of circumstance. Could he have avoided the rain, the heat, and the diseases? Perhaps. But for Napoleon, nature was always a double-edged sword. One minute it was in his favor, the next it was his greatest adversary. With each passing year, it seemed like nature itself was more and more in control of his fate. By 1813, Napoleon was no stranger to the unpredictable ways of nature, and yet, he still couldn't quite shake off the feeling that the weather was always one step ahead of him. His 1813 campaign in Germany, known as the Battle of Leipzig, would prove to be another painful reminder of how nature could flip the script on even the most meticulous plans. The battle was supposed to be the grand showdown, the decisive moment that would determine the fate of Europe. Napoleon's forces, though fewer in number, were still formidable, but they weren't prepared for the soggy, rain-soaked fields that awaited them. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's downfall in Leipzig was truly the result of a tactical miscalculation or the consequence of an unseasonably wet autumn. The rain transformed the battlefield into a quagmire, and the rivers that had been passable just days before became swollen and treacherous. Napoleon's cavalry, one of his greatest assets, was rendered nearly useless in the muck. The artillery, which had once been the backbone of his military might, was bogged down by the heavy mud. Napoleon's soldiers, drenched and struggling to march, found their fighting spirit sapped by the relentless weather. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the rain intensified. The ground became so slippery that it was difficult to maneuver even the most seasoned soldiers. Napoleon's once quick strikes became sluggish and ineffective, as the rain dampened both his momentum and his morale. It wasn't just the physical toll, the weather played with the very psychology of his troops. No one likes to fight in the rain, and when you add mud, exhaustion, and a retreating enemy, it's easy to see how morale can take a nosedive. The soggy conditions weren't the only weather-related setbacks Napoleon faced. Even when he managed to get his troops into position, the shifting winds and unpredictable storms made coordinating attacks difficult. The French forces, known for their discipline and precision, found themselves disoriented, unable to capitalize on openings in the enemy's formation. Napoleon, the man who had conquered most of Europe with his lightning-fast tactics, was now forced to fight at a pace that didn't suit his style, and nature was laughing in his face. Historians are still debating whether Napoleon should have pulled back and avoided Leipzig altogether. Could a more cautious approach have saved him from the disastrous consequences of the muddy battlefield? Would a weather report have helped him change course before it was too late? The answer, as usual, is clouded by uncertainty. Nature, after all, doesn't follow the rules of war. The Battle of Leipzig marked a turning point in Napoleon's empire. After being forced into retreat, he didn't just face the wrath of enemy armies. Nature had joined the ranks of his adversaries, and it seemed there was no escaping its grasp. But it wasn't just the rain or the mud that was making things worse for Napoleon. In the months following Leipzig, he would find himself battling the enemy of his own creation, the infamous Russian winter. The first time Napoleon marched into Russia in 1812, he believed it would be a quick victory. But as we know, winter wasn't kind to him or his men. Historians still argue whether Napoleon was naive to think he could outwit the Russian winter. But here's the thing, Napoleon was no rookie when it came to military strategy. He had already conquered much of Europe and had weathered some of the toughest climates known to man. He'd been through the scorching heat of Spain, the rains of Germany, and the dust storms of Egypt. So why didn't he anticipate Russia's frigid grasp? Was it hubris or a fatal oversight? Either way, his army, already stretched thin after weeks of brutal fighting, wasn't ready for what awaited them. As the winter descended on the Russian countryside, temperatures plummeted to unthinkable lows and snowstorms began to rage. Napoleon's men, poorly prepared for the harsh Russian climate, found themselves freezing to death by the thousands. The freezing temperatures sapped the strength of the soldiers, rendering them useless in combat. Frostbite was rampant, and the snowstorms became an insurmountable obstacle for the French forces. Supplies were scarce, and many of Napoleon's soldiers died from hunger, exposure, and illness. The freezing weather had become as lethal as any enemy army. Historians still argue over whether the winter was the ultimate killer of Napoleon's Grand Army. Was it just bad luck, or did the French army simply fail to plan adequately? While there's no denying that the winter played a huge role in the army's collapse, some historians argue that Napoleon's strategy was flawed from the start, and that the weather simply acted as the final blow. Napoleon, ever the tactician, had underestimated the Russian ability to retreat and destroy their own resources, leaving the French army exposed to the unforgiving cold. The retreat from Moscow was a bitter one, and as Napoleon's army staggered across the snow-covered Russian plains, nature showed no mercy. It's said that Napoleon's men were so desperate that they began to scavenge for food from the corpses of their fallen comrades. The brutal conditions turned their once proud army into a shell of its former self. Napoleon's dream of victory in Russia was buried under layers of snow and ice, and the once feared emperor now faced the humiliating prospect of retreating in shame. But despite all the loss, nature wasn't done with Napoleon yet. As his army limped back toward Europe, a new challenge awaited them. The weather would continue to play its part in the epic downfall of the French Empire. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow was a sight to behold, though not for the reasons Napoleon had hoped. His grand army, reduced to a shadow of its former glory, was on the run. And yet, the weather, ever present, kept up its relentless assault. The freezing temperatures and blizzards followed them every step of the way, as if nature itself was ensuring that the French would never forget their folly. But the weather wasn't done playing its part in Napoleon's saga. As the battered remnants of his forces slowly trudged westward, one more storm would turn the tide for the worst. Historians still debate whether Napoleon could have done more to protect his army from the brutal winter. Could he have waited for the weather to improve before advancing into Russia? Or was it just fate that had condemned him to this icy hell? Regardless, the Russian campaign would remain one of the most weather-dominated military disasters in history. Napoleon's once feared army, which had swept across Europe like a tidal wave, was now scattered and decimated thanks to the ruthless hand of nature. But it wasn't just the cold that crippled Napoleon's army. The toll of the retreat wasn't solely physical, it was psychological. The relentless storms, combined with the mounting casualties, created a sense of hopelessness among the troops. As morale plummeted, the men began to desert in droves. They had seen their comrades fall in the snow, and with no end in sight, it seemed like nothing could break the storm that surrounded them. As the surviving soldiers made their way back to Europe, Napoleon was forced to face the full extent of his failure. His plans had been thwarted not by a foreign army, but by the very forces of nature he had overlooked. And in a cruel twist of fate, as his retreating army staggered through the frozen Russian landscape, Napoleon's ambitions, once as towering as the mountains of the Alps, seemed as fragile as the snowflakes drifting down from the sky. The weather had done its part to humble one of history's greatest conquerors. And yet, the storm that had shattered Napoleon's Russian campaign was nothing compared to what was waiting for him on the horizon. The bitter reality was that Napoleon's greatest enemy, other than his own pride, was still to come, the end of his empire. Historians still question whether the Russian winter was the sole factor behind Napoleon's downfall, or whether his failure to properly understand the terrain and climate contributed just as much. After all, Napoleon wasn't just fighting the Russian army, he was fighting geography, weather, and a land that resisted all invaders. The ghost of that brutal retreat would haunt Napoleon for the rest of his life. As he returned to Paris, a shadow of the man who had once ruled Europe, Napoleon would come to realize that not even his genius could overcome the unpredictable force of nature. He had gambled everything on a Russian victory, and the weather had ensured his loss. Napoleon's return to Paris in 1814 marked the end of his grand Russian adventure, but it didn't signify the end of his empire. Far from it. In fact, Napoleon, ever the strategist, would make a comeback, rallying his forces for one final stand, only to be greeted once again by nature's unpredictable hand. The Battle of Waterloo, the final nail in the coffin of Napoleon's empire, wasn't just determined by the tactics of the armies on the field. Oh no, nature, as always, had a role to play. In this case, it was the infamous muddy battlefield that would make all the difference. Historians still argue whether the rain at Waterloo was a mere coincidence or a divine act of retribution. The morning of June 18, 1815, dawned with heavy clouds, and as the day wore on, the rain began to pour. By the time the battle began, the ground was a sodden, sticky mess. The mud, which was bad enough for infantry, was a nightmare for cavalry. Napoleon's beloved cavalry, once a powerful weapon in his military arsenal, was rendered nearly useless as the heavy downpour transformed the battlefield into a swamp. His horses struggled to move through the muck, and artillery was practically immobilized in the mire. Napoleon, who had relied on rapid, decisive movements in the past, found himself slowed down by the weather. The famous cavalry charges that had once broken enemy lines with ease now floundered in the mud, their momentum stifled by the weather. It wasn't just the horses, though. The French infantry, already weary from days of fighting, found themselves bogged down by the rain, their boots sinking into the thick, wet ground. The conditions were perfect for the British forces, who were able to hold their ground in the wet trenches and use the terrain to their advantage. Historians still debate whether the weather was the sole reason Napoleon's army lost at Waterloo or if it was a combination of tactical errors and the overwhelming pressure from the British and Prussian forces. Could Napoleon have won if the ground had been dry? Would the cavalry have been able to charge? Or was it simply a matter of timing? Had he not delayed the battle to allow the ground to dry out, he might have had a better chance of victory. One thing is clear, the rain at Waterloo was no small factor, and it added another layer of complexity to an already complicated battle. But, of course, the weather didn't just hurt Napoleon on the battlefield. It had played a critical role in his entire downfall. His retreat from Russia had been plagued by snow and ice, and his last battle was marred by rain and mud. Nature, in all its unpredictability, had become the one thing that even Napoleon, with all his power and genius, could not control. His failure at Waterloo would mark the end of his empire and the final chapter in a series of military campaigns that were constantly thwarted by forces beyond his control. Nature, once again, had delivered the final blow to Napoleon's reign. After Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, a quiet, windswept place far removed from the grandeur of his empire. The man who had once commanded the fate of nations now found himself at the mercy of nature once again. But even in his exile, the weather continued to play its role in shaping the final years of Napoleon's life. St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, was notorious for its unpredictable weather, often shifting from calm to stormy in the blink of an eye. Napoleon, already a shadow of the once mighty general, would spend his days watching as the storms rolled in from the ocean, each tempest a reminder of the chaotic forces he could never fully control. The isolation of St. Helena was a fate worse than defeat, and nature, in its endless unpredictability, ensured that Napoleon's final years were filled with nothing but gray skies and churning seas. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's deteriorating health was a result of the harsh conditions on the island or simply the slow decay of a man who had once held everything in his grasp. Some claim that the constant dampness of St. Helena, combined with the stress of his final years, contributed to his physical decline. Others argue that Napoleon's fatal illness was inevitable, a consequence of his high-stakes life and the strain of his years on the battlefield. Either way, it's clear that nature, once again, had the upper hand. Napoleon spent his time reflecting on the past, and the constant storms surrounding his exile served as a metaphor for his life. He had been swept up in a storm of ambition, and in the end, the same uncontrollable forces had stripped him of everything he had once conquered. The winds and rains of St. Helena were relentless, much like the series of missteps, defeats, and unpredictable weather patterns that had brought about the fall of his empire. But it wasn't just the external forces of nature that affected Napoleon during his final years. There was the internal storm, too, the gnawing regret, the bitter realization that his ambition had not only brought down his empire but had also cost him his health and his peace. Historians are divided on whether Napoleon ever truly regretted his actions, but it's clear that, in his final moments, he had time to reflect on the weather's role in his downfall. He had tried to master it, to bend it to his will, but it had always been one step ahead. As he lay in his bed, surrounded by the windswept island of St. Helena, Napoleon could do nothing but watch the storms rage outside. In the end, nature had come full circle, playing its final role in the tragic end of one of history's greatest figures. Napoleon's time on St. Helena was a curious affair, both for its isolation and its eerily symbolic connection to the forces that had dictated his fate. His exile, as bleak and lonely as it was, also gave Napoleon a certain freedom to reflect, something he had rarely had during his years of military conquest. As he spent his days wandering the rocky hills of St. Helena, Napoleon couldn't help but notice the parallels between his own life and the island's tempestuous weather. Just as the stormy seas would rush in unexpectedly, bringing with them destruction and chaos, his empire had once seemed untouchable, only to be ravaged by forces beyond his control. Nature, in its unpredictable splendor, had shaped Napoleon's empire and had helped bring it to its knees. But Napoleon wasn't the only one to be affected by the weather on St. Helena. The British soldiers who guarded him were also at the mercy of the island's shifting climate. The island's unique geography made it a challenging place to live, with humidity levels that would fluctuate between unbearable heat and cold, all the while keeping its residents in a near-constant state of discomfort. The surrounding seas, known for their violent storms, only compounded the isolation. Napoleon, once a master of strategy and tactics, was now nothing more than a spectator, as the weather took on a greater influence over his life than any enemy ever had. Historians still argue whether the extreme isolation of St. Helena played a significant role in Napoleon's declining health. Was it simply the result of years of exhaustion, or had the harsh weather and isolation on the island accelerated his demise? Some believe that Napoleon's lingering sense of defeat and depression, compounded by the weather's unyielding presence, contributed to the slow collapse of his body and mind. His once vibrant energy, so closely linked to his earlier victories, seemed to dissipate with each passing storm. The weather, too, was a reminder of the very things that Napoleon had never been able to conquer. On the battlefield, he had mastered terrain, outwitted generals, and manipulated conditions in ways that seemed almost supernatural. But on St. Helena, all of that power seemed meaningless. The island's erratic climate was a constant reminder that no matter how powerful a man might become, he could never control the forces of nature. In the end, it was the weather on this forgotten island that would keep Napoleon trapped in his own legacy, forever unable to escape the storm he had unleashed with his ambition. As the years wore on, Napoleon's health continued to deteriorate. The same weather that had once shaped his battles, creating scorching heat waves, freezing cold, and debilitating rain, now had a hand in his final decline. The damp, humid environment of St. Helena likely contributed to his chronic stomach problems, which some historians suspect were a major factor in his death. Was it just the stress and years of war catching up with him, or did the relentless island conditions exacerbate his condition? Historians still debate Napoleon's cause of death. Was it the result of natural causes, or had he been poisoned? Some suggest that his final illness, which left him pale and weak, could have been caused by the toxic environment of the island, with its moldy air and constant moisture. Others claim that Napoleon's chronic health issues were a culmination of his previous injuries and lifestyle. Either way, nature had become the silent accomplice in his downfall, just as it had been throughout his entire life. Napoleon Bonaparte's final days on St. Helena were spent in the shadow of the very weather that had shaped his fate. The storms, the winds, the endless rain, they all seemed like fitting metaphors for a man who had once held the world in his grasp, only to watch it slip away like water through his fingers. In the end, Napoleon was not defeated by another army, nor by his own ambition. He was defeated by the one force that no general, no tactician, no conqueror can ever control: nature itself. Napoleon's death on May 5, 1821, brought an official end to the saga of his empire, but the weather's relentless role in his life didn't cease with his passing. The stormy climate of St. Helena, which had once reflected the turmoil of his final years, seemed to follow him into his legacy. His death, surrounded by the very elements that had been his constant adversary, was fitting in an almost poetic sense. The man who had risen to the heights of power through his own cunning and ambition had been ultimately defeated not by the armies of Europe, but by the uncontrollable forces of nature. And while Napoleon's tomb in Paris may be an imposing symbol of his once great empire, The winds of St. Helena were an equally lasting reminder that even the most powerful empires can be brought down by nature's caprice. Historians still debate the exact cause of Napoleon's death, with some claiming it was stomach cancer, others speculating that he may have been poisoned by political enemies. However, there's another school of thought that points to his health being exacerbated by the environment on St. Helena. The island's humid climate, coupled with the psychological toll of his isolation, may have played a crucial role in his decline. The rainstorms, the unrelenting winds, and the damp conditions were all constant reminders of the forces he could never control. Perhaps it was in those moments of solitude, surrounded by the swirling storms, that Napoleon finally realized the full extent of his defeat, not just in battle, but in the very world he had once conquered. Napoleon's final years were a harsh contrast to the grandeur of his earlier reign. No longer the invincible general, he had been reduced to a prisoner of weather and circumstance. Yet, even in his exile, there was something strangely fitting about it all. The storms that had delayed his campaigns, the relentless heat that had drained his troops, the freezing cold that had ravaged his army in Russia, these natural forces were present throughout his rise and fall. And as he faced the end of his life, nature's role in his story seemed as inevitable as his ambition had been in his youth. As Napoleon lay dying on St. Helena, historians began to reflect on the broader implications of his life. Was his downfall a mere result of bad decisions, or was it part of a larger, cosmic joke played by nature? Napoleon, the man who had once defied the odds of battle, could do nothing against the uncontrollable forces that had shaped his life. The weather, from the storms of Spain to the winter of Russia and the damp winds of St. Helena, had played a silent yet significant role in his empire's demise. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's final days were marked by a deep sense of regret or simply resignation. Did he realize that his empire had crumbled under forces beyond his control, or did he hold onto the belief that he could have overcome it all with a little more luck? One thing is certain: nature had the last laugh. Napoleon had conquered nearly all of Europe, yet nature's unpredictable storms and seasons were always lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the years passed, the weather continued to shape how we remember Napoleon. The way he was painted in history, as a man of brilliance, determination, and perhaps too much ambition, was a direct reflection of how history remembers the impact of nature. It was nature that first greeted him as a young general, with the scorching heat of Egypt, the punishing cold of Russia, and the storms that delayed him at Waterloo. And in the end, it was nature that finally took him, not with a sword, but with the quiet power of the island's relentless climate. As Napoleon's body was laid to rest on St. Helena, nature's role in his life didn't fade. In fact, the island itself seemed to have become an eternal reflection of the unpredictable forces that had governed his rise and fall. His tomb on the island, surrounded by harsh winds and shifting weather patterns, stood as a permanent reminder that, despite all his triumphs, the elements had played an undeniable part in shaping his legacy. The island, small and isolated, was a fitting symbol for the man who had once ruled vast empires, only to find himself confined by the forces of nature, a prisoner not of war, but of weather. As Napoleon's empire fell and his name became synonymous with both genius and failure, historians continued to dissect his reign, often overlooking one crucial factor: nature's silent but powerful presence. For Napoleon, weather was more than just a backdrop to his campaigns, it was a central character. From the scorching Egyptian deserts to the frozen Russian plains, weather didn't just affect his battles. It was often the unseen hand that pushed him toward victory or defeat. The question remains: was Napoleon's downfall a result of his own ambition, or was he doomed from the start by the very forces he could never control? Historians still argue whether the weather's role in Napoleon's demise has been overstated. Could he have triumphed over the Russian winter if he had been more prepared? Could a better understanding of the weather in Spain have saved his army from the blistering heat and disease? Some believe that, had Napoleon been better at predicting or adapting to the elements, he might have avoided some of his more catastrophic losses. But others argue that nature is inherently unpredictable, and no amount of planning could have shielded him from the extremes it threw his way. Either way, the weather undeniably shaped the course of his empire, for better and for worse. In the wake of his defeat at Waterloo, historians and soldiers alike have continued to study Napoleon's campaigns, looking for the secret to his military genius. But perhaps the real secret to his success and failure lies in his relationship with nature. Despite his many triumphs, it was nature that always had the final say. As much as Napoleon controlled his men, his tactics, and his battlefield, he could never master the wind, the rain, or the snow. They were the forces he could never bend to his will. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? The man who could conquer Europe, but couldn't predict the weather. Now, as we look back at Napoleon's life and his empire, it's clear that nature wasn't just an external force in his story, it was a character that shaped his destiny. From the heat of Egypt to the cold of Russia, from the rains of Spain to the mud of Waterloo, the weather wasn't just a backdrop. It was a participant in Napoleon's saga, and in many ways, it was as powerful an enemy as any general he faced. Historians still find themselves fascinated by this aspect of Napoleon's life. They study his campaigns, his strategies, and his tactics, but they often overlook the one thing he couldn't control: nature. And yet, nature, in all its unpredictable glory, had the last laugh, proving once again that no matter how brilliant a general might be, some things are simply beyond human control. As Napoleon lay on St. Helena, reflecting on the storms of his life, he must have realized that nature, not just his enemies, had brought him to this final, isolated end. After Napoleon's death, the weather continued to play a key role in shaping the way his empire was remembered. St. Helena, where his body lay, was isolated from the rest of the world, surrounded by the relentless Atlantic winds. But in 1840, when his remains were finally exhumed and returned to France, the journey was marked by more than just a ceremonial procession. It was as if nature itself had a hand in completing the story of his life. The ships carrying his remains encountered rough seas, and the journey was delayed several times due to storms, symbolic, perhaps, of the man who had once swept across Europe with all the force of a thunderstorm, only to be stopped by the very forces of nature that had once shaped his reign. Historians often overlook the uncanny role weather continued to play in the aftermath of Napoleon's death. His final return to France was not an easy voyage, and the turbulent seas, delaying his body's journey to Paris, seemed to be a continuation of the struggle he'd faced throughout his life. Napoleon, who had once controlled armies and empires, now found himself at the mercy of the wind and waves. For all the grandeur of his empire, nature was the one force that never bowed to him. Even as Napoleon's remains were interred in the Grand Tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, the weather continued to remind the French people of his extraordinary yet turbulent reign. In the years following his burial, France experienced some unusual weather patterns, especially harsh winters and dry summers, that many saw as omens. Napoleon's return to Paris may have been celebrated as a triumphant moment in French history, but the continuing unpredictability of the weather served as a reminder of the fickle and unpredictable forces that had shaped his fate. Historians are still divided about the role of nature in Napoleon's legacy. Some believe that his rise and fall were determined entirely by his own decisions and ambitions, while others suggest that the weather played a pivotal role in the empire's dissolution. Could Napoleon have avoided the Russian winter? Could he have been more strategic during his retreat? Or was it simply that nature had dealt him an unbeatable hand? We'll never know for sure, but it's hard to ignore the fact that weather shaped nearly every key moment of his reign. Moreover, the very nature of Napoleon's legacy, the way he's remembered, was influenced by the weather. Much like the unpredictable storms that had ravaged his campaigns, his reputation has ebbed and flowed over the years, with historians often grappling with the full extent of his genius versus his shortcomings. Was he an invincible conqueror, whose failures were the result of nature's unrelenting interference? Or was he simply a man whose ambition ultimately outpaced his ability to adapt to the circumstances around him? The passage of time has also played a part in how we view Napoleon today. With the passage of each season, with every changing of the winds, his legacy has become both more mythic and more contested. The nature of his rise, his conquests, and his eventual downfall continues to fascinate scholars as they search for new perspectives on his reign, always wondering whether the weather was more than just a backdrop to his story, whether it was, in fact, a central character in the drama of his life. The truth is, Napoleon's empire was as much shaped by the weather as it was by his military genius. And though his empire eventually fell, the story of how the weather, those unyielding forces of nature, played its part is one that continues to endure, shaping the way we remember one of history's most complex figures. As much as Napoleon tried to control the tides of history, in the end, nature proved to be the one force he could never dominate. Napoleon's legacy, like his empire, is tangled in the complex dance between human ambition and the uncontrollable forces of nature. The narrative of his life and downfall is forever intertwined with the unpredictable elements that shaped both his military victories and defeats. And in the years following his death, as France and the world reflected on the man who had once held sway over Europe, nature continued to remind historians of the raw, untamable forces that had contributed to his downfall. The 19th century saw a resurgence of interest in Napoleon, particularly after his remains were brought back to France. The weather, ever present in the form of storms, floods, and strange weather patterns, seemed to symbolize the ongoing tumultuous legacy of the once great emperor. In some ways, it felt like the weather had remained as much a part of Napoleon's identity as the battles he fought or the crown he wore. Historians still debate whether Napoleon could have avoided the storms, both literal and metaphorical, that punctuated his reign. Could he have changed his approach to Russia, for example, and avoided the crushing effects of the winter? Could he have made better decisions regarding his retreat, rather than giving in to the forces that nature had set in motion? The questions remain open-ended, with many arguing that Napoleon was simply a victim of circumstance, unable to control the environment that ultimately helped shape his empire's collapse. For all his brilliance, Napoleon was never able to master the weather, and in the end, nature had the final say. The relentless Russian winter, the rains that hindered his cavalry at Waterloo, the scorching heat in Spain, each of these natural forces added another layer of difficulty to his campaigns. And while Napoleon may have been one of history's greatest tacticians, he was powerless against the forces of nature that seemed to conspire against him. But Napoleon's story is not just one of defeat. It is also a testament to resilience, to the way in which a man, despite the most impossible odds, can rise to unimaginable heights. It is true that nature played its part in his fall, but it is equally true that it was Napoleon's mastery of terrain, his understanding of battle conditions, and his ability to adapt to shifting circumstances that allowed him to achieve some of his greatest victories. His campaigns were often shaped by the weather, but they were also a reflection of his ability to anticipate and use the natural environment to his advantage. At the same time, his undoing also reflects the idea that even the most formidable force of nature can be brought to its knees. Napoleon's army, once unstoppable, was crushed by the forces of a harsh winter and an unforgiving battlefield. His story, in this sense, serves as a reminder of the fragility of power, even for a man who had once conquered most of Europe. Historians still argue about the ultimate significance of Napoleon's battles. Was it his strategy, or was it the weather that ultimately determined his fate? Could he have won at Waterloo had the ground not been so treacherous? Could the Russian winter have been overcome with better preparation? Or was his defeat simply a matter of time, an inevitability shaped by the balance of power, luck, and nature? Nature's role in Napoleon's life is a reminder that, despite all the power a leader might hold, there are some forces that cannot be controlled. The winds, the rains, the frost. They are indifferent to the ambitions of men, and history, too, moves according to its own rhythms, often shaped by forces that lie beyond human reach. As we remember Napoleon today, we can't help but see his story as one of grandeur, ambition, and failure. But we must also remember that the weather, in its own subtle and powerful way, had just as much to say in shaping the arc of his empire. From the heat of Egypt to the frost of Russia, from the rains of Spain to the mud of Waterloo, nature was an ever-present companion in Napoleon's saga, a force that he could never quite conquer, no matter how much he tried. Napoleon's relationship with nature wasn't just about the physical storms he faced. There was a deeper connection between his psyche and the unrelenting forces of the elements. For a man who had spent his entire life fighting for control, nature's unpredictability seemed almost personal. Whether it was the freezing cold in Russia or the relentless rain in Spain, Napoleon faced a challenge not only of military tactics but of enduring the constant reminder that he could never truly command everything. Historians still wrestle with the question of how much Napoleon understood the role weather played in his fate. Was he aware that his army's failure in Russia was largely due to factors outside his control? Could he have done more to plan for the Russian winter? Or was the defeat simply an unavoidable consequence of an empire stretched too thin, advancing on terrain that had already proved disastrous for invaders? Some argue that Napoleon's true downfall was his overconfidence in his ability to control not just men, but nature itself. He had won so many battles through his brilliance that he began to believe no force could stand against him, even if that force was the bitter cold of a Russian winter. But Napoleon's army was not just a collection of soldiers. It was a microcosm of the empire he had built, and the same forces that wore down his men in Russia also echoed through his empire. As his empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult for him to control not just the terrain, but the very weather that affected each region he sought to conquer. Nature was constantly reshaping his plans, making the once mighty general look increasingly powerless in the face of its fury. After the catastrophic retreat from Moscow, it's easy to see how Napoleon would have viewed the world through a different lens. The man who once stood at the helm of the most powerful army in Europe was now a man haunted by the elements he could never master. Even in his final days on St. Helena, Napoleon likely found himself reflecting on those storms that had shaped his campaigns. The way the winds had shifted, the way the snow had fallen, and the way the weather had always been one step ahead of him. Historians continue to analyze how much Napoleon truly understood the role of chance in his empire's decline. Some suggest that his downfall was a combination of bad decisions, bad luck, and, of course, the weather. Others argue that Napoleon's nature as a conqueror made him blind to the risks posed by an unpredictable world. Whatever the reason, by the time of his final exile, it was clear that nature had, in its own quiet way, rewritten the fate of his empire. The storms of St. Helena were not just metaphors for Napoleon's decline. They were a reminder of the forces he had once sought to dominate and control. The wind that howled through his exile wasn't just a passing inconvenience. It was the very echo of the world he had tried to conquer. Even in death, Napoleon couldn't escape the storms that had once shaped his life. And in the years following his death, the weather continued to influence the perception of his legacy. After Napoleon's remains were returned to France, the journey was marked by strange weather phenomena, storms that delayed the ships, a kind of weathered tribute to the emperor who had once defied the odds, only to be undone by forces beyond his control. This final homecoming, delayed by nature itself, seemed to suggest that Napoleon's fate would always be marked by the winds of uncertainty, as if nature were reminding the world of its ultimate dominance over even the greatest of empires. Napoleon's legacy, then, is not just about his victories or his defeats. It is a legacy written in the weather. The intense heat of Egypt, the freezing winters of Russia, the relentless rains of Spain, and the mud of Waterloo, they are all part of the story of Napoleon Bonaparte. Nature, with all its unpredictability, played a crucial role in the rise and fall of one of history's greatest figures. Historians may argue whether Napoleon's downfall was truly inevitable, whether better planning or different decisions could have changed the course of history. But no matter how much we analyze his military genius or his political maneuvering, one thing remains clear: Napoleon, for all his brilliance, was at the mercy of the elements. And in the end, nature was the one force that even he could never conquer. After Napoleon's death, his empire was no more, but his story persisted, etched into the very fabric of history. In a sense, nature continued to shape how we would remember him, from the way storms marked his final years to the shifting climate of the French public's opinion about his legacy. For some, Napoleon was a symbol of unchecked ambition, a genius who reached too far and was destroyed by his own hubris. For others, he remained a tragic hero, an emperor who met an untimely end, victimized by forces he could neither control nor understand. And yet, nature had the final word. It's not just the storms he faced during his campaigns, or the weather that trapped him on St. Helena. It's the way his entire rise and fall seemed dictated by the whims of the environment. His invasions of Spain, Egypt, and Russia were all subject to climate, terrain, and weather conditions that rendered even the most carefully laid plans ineffective. There is a certain irony in the fact that Napoleon, the man who seemed to defy all odds, was consistently thwarted by something as unpredictable as the weather. Historians often debate how much Napoleon's failures were the result of his own mistakes versus the uncontrollable circumstances around him. Could Napoleon have won in Russia if he had waited for the weather to improve? Was it simply a matter of Napoleon underestimating the Russian resistance, or did the bitter winter truly spell the end for his army? Some argue that had Napoleon adapted to the unpredictable nature of the land, he might have prevailed. Yet, others suggest that the weather was always the deciding factor, nature's hand playing a bigger role than Napoleon ever acknowledged. In many ways, Napoleon's story is a study in the limits of human ambition. It's easy to admire his determination, his ability to command armies, and his relentless pursuit of power. But the weather reminds us that there are limits to what one man can control. Nature, with its seasons, its storms, and its unpredictable forces, is indifferent to the ambitions of humankind. And no matter how grand Napoleon's plans were, they were always vulnerable to the elements. The mud at Waterloo was a key moment in this. The battlefield, churned by days of rain, turned into a sticky, unforgiving trap that slowed Napoleon's cavalry, made movement impossible for his artillery, and ultimately gave the British forces the advantage they needed to defeat him. Historians still debate whether, had the ground been dry, Napoleon would have won. Could he have overcome the numerical disadvantage with the speed and power of his cavalry? Was the battle truly a loss of Napoleon's own making, or did the weather make the difference between victory and defeat? No matter the answer, the fact remains that weather played a pivotal role in Napoleon's final military failure. This theme of nature's dominance over Napoleon's destiny is not just confined to his military career. It runs through his entire life and legacy. From his early victories to his eventual downfall, the weather was always there, shaping the course of his history. Napoleon himself may have been a master of strategy, but when it came to the forces of nature, he was no different from any other man. The very elements that had fueled his rise, his ability to read terrain, adjust tactics to environmental factors, also played a part in his fall. Nature, in the end, could not be outwitted, outmanned, or defeated. The return of Napoleon's remains to France in 1840, with the storms that delayed the ships carrying his body, was perhaps a fitting end to a life so deeply intertwined with nature's forces. As his tomb at Les Invalides became a monument to his reign, the weather continued to reflect the complexity of his legacy. For all the grandeur of his empire, Napoleon's final resting place is a reminder of the unpredictability and uncontrollability of the natural world, the one force that, in the end, proved stronger than his empire. Historians still ask whether Napoleon's empire could have endured longer had he made different decisions, whether the French Empire could have survived if he had adapted to the natural challenges he faced. The weather was a relentless force, and in the end, it was the weather that held the power to end his reign. Napoleon's story, however, is also a lesson in the unpredictability of history itself. Nature will continue to play its part, shaping the rise and fall of empires, just as it shaped the life of one of history's most remarkable figures. As time marches on, Napoleon's legacy has only grown, but so too has the mythos surrounding the role nature played in his rise and fall. It's easy to look back on his reign and imagine a man whose genius and determination were enough to shape the course of history. Yet, the more we study his campaigns, the clearer it becomes that the forces of nature were just as influential in defining Napoleon's story as his own brilliant tactics. From the blistering heat in Egypt to the freezing cold in Russia, the storms at Waterloo to the calm yet oppressive winds on St. Helena, Napoleon's life was shaped by something much larger than himself. Historians still debate the long-term implications of Napoleon's defeat. Could he have done more to mitigate the impact of the weather on his empire? Was he truly a victim of circumstance, or was his downfall an inevitable consequence of his overreaching ambitions? The role of weather in Napoleon's decline was not only a question of battle tactics, but also a question of leadership, decision-making, and resilience. Napoleon's overconfidence in his own ability to control the variables around him may have blinded him to the dangers that nature posed. The weather was never just a backdrop. It was a central figure in the drama of his life, a participant that had as much influence as the men he led. Take his decision to march into Russia, for example. Could he have avoided the Russian winter if he had waited longer, or would he have been forced to fight a war of attrition regardless of the weather? Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to adapt to challenges on the battlefield, yet when it came to nature, he seemed powerless. The Russian winter, with its freezing temperatures, biting winds, and endless snow, tore through his ranks like a hammer. Many historians argue that no amount of strategy could have overcome such an adversary. Nature, in this case, was a foe so formidable that even Napoleon's greatest military mind couldn't outmaneuver it. But Napoleon's story is not one of complete failure. His ability to read the land and use nature to his advantage in many other campaigns shows that, at times, he understood the value of terrain. The way he took advantage of the desert winds in Egypt or used the rivers to maneuver his forces in the early days of his reign shows a man who could leverage nature's power when it suited him. It was only when the elements turned against him, when the terrain became an unyielding force rather than a tool, that he found himself on the losing side of history. In the years following his defeat, Napoleon's story has been told and retold, each telling shaped by the natural elements that defined his campaigns. The wet, muddy fields of Waterloo, the frozen wastelands of Russia, and the sweltering deserts of Egypt, each one a vivid reminder of the forces beyond Napoleon's control. These weather patterns, though often seen as incidental, were often the final factor in his military successes and failures. It was never just about strategy. It was also about the wind, the rain, the sun, and the snow that played an equally significant role in shaping his destiny. Even after his death, the weather continued to haunt his memory. The storms that delayed the return of his remains to France were not just an inconvenience. They were an echo of the tumultuous life he had led. It was as if the universe itself was reminding the world that no matter how powerful a man may become, he is always at the mercy of nature. Today, we look back on Napoleon as a larger-than-life figure, a man whose influence shaped the modern world. But as much as his genius in warfare and politics shaped Europe, we must remember that it was also the forces of nature that guided his fate. His empire fell not just because of strategic errors or military defeats, but because the elements conspired against him, making his boldest moves a series of miscalculations. In the end, history will remember Napoleon as much for his ability to adapt to the forces of nature as it will for his failures in the face of them. Historians still argue whether Napoleon could have achieved greater success had he understood the weather's influence more deeply. Some suggest that his downfall was a result of his overconfidence, his belief that he could control everything, nature included. Others argue that it was nature itself, in all its capriciousness, that sealed his fate. Whether his defeat was the result of his decisions or the hand of fate, one thing is certain: nature, in all its fury, played the role of an unyielding adversary in the epic saga of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's empire may have crumbled, but the mark he left on history is undeniable. His military genius, his ambitious plans, and his imperial vision continue to be studied, admired, and scrutinized. Yet, the forces of nature that played such a key role in his downfall have a way of reminding us that even the most extraordinary individuals are vulnerable to the elements. As time passes, Napoleon's legacy endures, and nature, the force that brought him low, has only become a more potent symbol of his ultimate defeat. Historians still question the full scope of Napoleon's understanding of the world around him. Did he truly grasp the power of nature in his campaigns? Was he so consumed by his own ambitions that he failed to consider the inevitability of environmental forces impacting his strategies? Could he have achieved the same successes had he been more attuned to the weather's unpredictable nature, or was it simply fate that led to his undoing? It is difficult to say, and the debate endures. But one thing is clear: Napoleon was never a man who sat idly by, waiting for the wind to change. He was a master tactician, a visionary, and an empire builder who understood the importance of terrain and geography in warfare. However, even he couldn't escape the whims of nature, which seemed to continuously thwart his carefully laid plans. Let's not forget his early campaigns, where Napoleon adapted to different climates with strategic brilliance. He had made use of Egypt's deserts and Egypt's sandstorms to launch surprise attacks, understanding the power of the environment to disrupt enemy forces. In those moments, the weather was his ally. But in later years, particularly in Russia, Napoleon found that the weather, once his tool, had become his greatest adversary. Napoleon was not a man known for admitting defeat, but when the Russian winter closed in on him, even his indomitable spirit could not prevent the inevitable. His army, decimated by frostbite and starvation, trudged back through the snow, defeated not just by the Russian army but by the cruel weather itself. Historians still speculate on how different the outcome could have been if Napoleon had chosen to retreat earlier or waited for better conditions. Was it his inability to read the signs of an approaching winter that sealed the fate of his campaign? Did his ambition cloud his judgment, making him ignore the risks of the environment? The truth remains elusive, but one thing is certain: nature had its own plans, and they did not align with Napoleon's. Napoleon's defeat in Russia was a moment where nature revealed its full, unyielding power, but it wasn't the only time weather played a decisive role. At the Battle of Waterloo, the rain-soaked fields were crucial to the outcome. The muddy terrain slowed Napoleon's cavalry, a decisive force in his early victories, and delayed his artillery's advance, weakening his position. While historians often cite strategic mistakes or poor leadership decisions, it is clear that the weather at Waterloo had a lasting impact on the outcome. Even the best-laid plans could be undone by something as uncontrollable as a thunderstorm. But Napoleon's story isn't just about failure, it's also about resilience. Despite nature's repeated challenges, he continued to fight, adapt, and overcome. And in his final years, exiled on St. Helena, he remained a man of action and reflection, looking back on his life and acknowledging the forces, both human and environmental, that shaped it. Nature's power, it seems, was something that both humbled and fascinated him, especially as he faced the end of his empire and his life. The winds that whipped across the island were a stark contrast to the storm of his earlier years, where he had commanded armies and shaped nations. On St. Helena, he was a prisoner to the very elements that had once been his allies. Historians still debate how much Napoleon's later years were shaped by the weather. The damp, cold environment of St. Helena, combined with his failing health, undoubtedly took a toll. But it wasn't just the physical effects that stood out, it was the symbolism of it all. The storms and the rain, the unpredictable winds that swept across his exile, mirrored the larger forces of nature that had shaped his entire life. The final chapter of his life was written by the same weather that had swept across battlefields and shaped the rise and fall of his empire. Nature, in all its fury, had played the role of both hero and villain in Napoleon's life. It had helped him rise, it had hindered his greatest victories, and in the end, it had delivered the fatal blow to his empire. But the one thing Napoleon could never control, nature's wild unpredictability, was also what made his story so compelling. Even in his exile, surrounded by the elements, Napoleon remained the same man who had once commanded the forces of Europe. In the end, nature had the last word, but it had not taken away Napoleon's legacy. The way history remembers Napoleon today is inextricably linked to the forces of nature that shaped his journey. From his meteoric rise to power to his ultimate downfall, nature's involvement cannot be ignored. While historians debate the role of Napoleon's leadership, decisions, and ambition, the fact remains that the natural world, its storms, its winds, its harsh winters, was a constant and unpredictable factor in his rise and fall. Napoleon's triumphs on the battlefield were often marked by his ability to adapt to the environment. He understood the importance of terrain, the way the weather could become a weapon or an ally, and how the forces of nature could be used to outmaneuver his enemies. In Egypt, for example, Napoleon harnessed the oppressive desert heat, using it to his advantage against the British and the Mamluks. He knew how to exploit the terrain, how the heat and sand could overwhelm an enemy unprepared for the harsh conditions. And yet, as his empire grew, so too did the scale of the environmental challenges he would face. But by the time Napoleon marched into Russia in 1812, His previous successes seemed to have blinded him to the risks posed by the weather. The Russian winter, as brutal as it was only one part of the larger catastrophe. His forces, already stretched thin, were ill-prepared for the extreme cold. Historians still debate whether his decision to invade was a result of miscalculating the Russian resolve or simply underestimating the power of the Russian environment. Whatever the reason, nature dealt him a blow that would change the course of his empire's future. As Napoleon's army retreated from Moscow, with many soldiers perishing from the cold, the weather became a ruthless enemy, claiming more lives than the Russian army itself. Napoleon's earlier victories had all been marked by his ability to control circumstances, to outmaneuver his opponents, and to strike when the conditions were right. But the Russian winter was something entirely beyond his reach, and it destroyed his grand army, one step at a time. And yet, Napoleon continued to press on. Despite his devastating losses, he did not surrender to nature. His return to Paris, though marked by defeat, was also a testament to his resilience. Nature may have defeated his army, but it could not defeat his will. The weather had humbled him, but it had not broken him completely. Napoleon's ability to bounce back, his return to power in the 100 Days, proved that he was, in many ways, as formidable as the weather itself. He may not have conquered nature, but he never stopped trying to challenge it. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's return in 1815 would have succeeded if the weather had been different. Some suggest that the delay in getting reinforcements, the rains that softened the ground at Waterloo, and the stormy weather that prevented his full assault on the British forces may have been decisive factors in his ultimate defeat. In some ways, the weather had come full circle, playing the role of both ally and enemy at different points in his career. Just as it had helped him achieve some of his greatest victories, it now contributed to his most humbling defeat. Napoleon's final years on St. Helena would see him removed from the relentless storms of his empire. Yet, even there, the weather remained an ever-present force, a reminder of the world he had once sought to control. The wind, the rain, the unpredictable climate of the island all seemed to symbolize his relationship with nature. The man who had once been the master of armies and empires was now a prisoner, at the mercy of the very forces he could not command. And in his final days, he must have known that, despite all his accomplishments, the weather had had the last word. The mythology of Napoleon, much like the weather, remains ever-changing. As we reflect on his life, we can see that nature played an equally pivotal role in shaping his story, as did the men who fought alongside him, the generals he battled, and the decisions he made. Whether it was the scorching heat in Egypt, the icy winds in Russia, or the muddy battlefield at Waterloo, nature was always there, shaping the course of history in ways that even Napoleon's genius could not predict or control. Historians still argue over what Napoleon could have done differently, whether his downfall was simply the result of an overextended empire or if he could have avoided the environmental challenges that ultimately contributed to his defeat. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest lesson of Napoleon's life is that no matter how brilliant or ambitious a man may be, nature will always have the final say. And that, above all, is a humbling thought, one that ensures Napoleon's place in history is as much about his relationship with the natural world as it is about his military conquests. As we near the end of Napoleon's story, it becomes clear that his empire, in many ways, was defined not just by the battles he fought, but by the forces he could never control, the weather. This might sound like an oversimplification, but when you think about it, it's almost poetic. The very empire that conquered Europe was eventually undone by the same unpredictable elements that shaped its rise. For all of Napoleon's military brilliance, his ultimate downfall occurred not in the battlefield of strategy or tactics, but in the chaotic forces of nature that neither strategy nor ambition could conquer. The further we move away from Napoleon's era, the more his legacy seems to merge with the weather itself, both a symbol of his empire's rise and its ruin. From the searing heat in Egypt, which seemed almost like a precursor to the inferno of ambition that drove him, to the chilling frost of Russia that crushed his hopes of ever reaching the heart of the Russian Empire, nature was his persistent, unpredictable counterpart. The storms at Waterloo, the oppressive humidity of St. Helena, each one a chapter in the greater story of Napoleon's reign. Perhaps no one could have foreseen how much the weather would dictate the ebb and flow of his empire's fortunes. Historians still grapple with Napoleon's defeat. Was it his decision-making, the strategic errors, or was it simply that the weather had its hand in his downfall? Some argue that it wasn't just the snow of Russia or the rains of Waterloo, but rather his failure to adapt to these forces. He was so accustomed to turning the tides of battle with his skill and tactics that he never seemed to fully acknowledge the unpredictable nature of the land, the elements, and their power to undo all his plans. But as much as we look at Napoleon's failures, we must also recognize the remarkable successes he achieved in the face of nature's wrath. Napoleon had an extraordinary ability to use terrain and weather to his advantage when it suited him. His campaigns were often marked by an uncanny ability to predict and adapt to environmental factors, whether it was using the heat of the Egyptian desert to launch surprise attacks or utilizing the rivers of Italy to outflank his enemies. In these moments, Napoleon was truly a master of the elements, able to turn nature's forces into allies. But as the empire expanded, so did the number of regions with climates and terrains far beyond his control. Napoleon's legacy is a paradox. He was a man who understood how terrain could be wielded like a weapon, but who ultimately failed to predict the forces that could ruin his entire empire. The paradox of nature in his story isn't just in the way it helped him rise or fall, it's in how, despite his power, he was never able to master it fully. Nature, whether through raging storms, blistering heat, or bone-chilling cold, remained the one force that Napoleon could not bend to his will. His empire, for all its might, could not withstand the wrath of nature forever. Even after his exile to St. Helena, it was clear that nature continued to play a significant role in Napoleon's life. Surrounded by windswept cliffs and the isolation of the island, Napoleon found himself at the mercy of the same unpredictable forces that had thwarted him in Russia and Spain. His health deteriorated in the damp climate, a stark contrast to the man who once stood on the battlefields of Europe, commanding legions. The very winds that kept him trapped on St. Helena became the metaphor for his fallen empire, isolated, helpless, and constantly at the mercy of forces far beyond his control. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's exile was the true end of his reign, or whether it was simply the final chapter in a story that had already been written by the forces of nature. Could Napoleon have fought back from the brink? Could he have recovered, just as he had so many times before? Or was the slow decline of his empire simply nature's final answer to a man who had spent his life trying to control what could never be controlled? The answer remains unclear, but one thing is certain. Nature, the one force Napoleon could never conquer, has come to define the final chapter of his empire's story. And as we reflect on the lessons his life provides, it's impossible to ignore the ever-present role of weather and climate in shaping the history of this remarkable figure. Napoleon's legacy is, in many ways, an enduring reminder that the forces of nature, often underestimated and overlooked, can be as powerful, if not more so, than the greatest armies or the most brilliant strategies. The storms that shaped his life were not merely background noise. They were central to his success and failure. And in the end, nature proved to be the final, undying force in his life, a force that even the most powerful empire could not overcome. As we conclude Napoleon's saga, it's important to reflect on the larger lessons his life teaches us. Lessons not just about power, leadership, and ambition, but about the humbling inevitability of nature. Napoleon's empire, built on the backs of relentless ambition and military prowess, ultimately succumbed to forces that no amount of strategy or willpower could control. The storms, the deserts, the snow, each of these natural forces was as crucial a factor in shaping his destiny as any human action, and perhaps even more decisive. Historians, in their analyses of Napoleon's life, often focus on his brilliant military mind, his tactical genius, and his ambition. These qualities undoubtedly shaped the course of history, but so too did his inability to account for the full scope of nature's influence. Nature had its role in both his rise and fall, an ever-present participant in his drama, one that, in the end, was more powerful than his ability to command armies. Napoleon was a man who understood the importance of weather in warfare. His campaigns in Egypt, where he used the desert heat to his advantage, and his early successes across Europe show a leader who could read the land like a map. But as his empire expanded, so did the unpredictable nature of the terrain he had to navigate. He faced new climates, new weather patterns, and new challenges. From the frozen fields of Russia to the torrential rains at Waterloo, Napoleon's strategic genius was repeatedly stymied by forces beyond his control. Even in his exile on St. Helena, nature's dominance in his life remained evident. The windswept island that had once been his prison became a symbol of his entire empire's fall, a place where the same forces that shaped his grand campaigns now worked against him, slowing his physical decline and making his solitude even more unbearable. Perhaps Napoleon's greatest struggle in his final years wasn't just with his isolation or his failing health, but with the recognition that he had spent his entire life defying the odds, only to be undone by something as unyielding and unpredictable as the weather. Historians still question what might have been. Could Napoleon have won in Russia if he had been better prepared for the winter? Could he have triumphed at Waterloo if the ground had been dry? Could a different strategy have saved his empire? The answer to these questions remains uncertain. But what is clear is that no amount of preparation, no level of ambition, could have shielded him from nature's role in his downfall. Napoleon's story is a stark reminder of the limits of human control. He was a man who conquered much of Europe, who changed the course of history, and who redefined the art of war. Yet, in the end, nature proved to be his greatest adversary. The elements, from the freezing cold of Russia to the rain-soaked battlefield at Waterloo, consistently shaped his empire's fate. And just as he could not control his empire's fate, neither could he control the forces of nature that swept across his life and empire. As we reflect on Napoleon's life and the enduring legacy he left behind, it's important to consider the ultimate lesson of his story. No matter how powerful a man may be, there are forces in the world, forces like nature, that even the most brilliant of minds cannot control. The weather, in all its chaotic glory, had a hand in shaping Napoleon's empire and, in the end, brought about its fall. Napoleon's life remains one of the most fascinating and complex stories in history. His ambition, genius, and drive to reshape the world are still studied today, and his impact on European history cannot be overstated. Yet, even in his brilliance, nature had its say. The story of Napoleon is not just a story of military conquests and political maneuvering. It's also a reminder of the unpredictable, uncontrollable forces that exist beyond human control. And that, perhaps, is the most humbling part of all. As we reach the final chapter of Napoleon's story, we find ourselves grappling not just with the details of his military campaigns or political maneuvers, but with the deeper, more humbling truth that permeates his legacy. Nature is an inescapable force. Throughout his life, Napoleon faced battles on many fronts, against armies, politicians, and ideologies, but it was the unyielding power of nature that ultimately played a decisive role in his fate. In the end, Napoleon's greatest achievement might not have been his conquests, but his ability to live as long as he did, trying to outwit the weather, the seasons, and the forces that shaped the world around him. Historians are still drawn to Napoleon's story because it is a perfect blend of ambition, genius, and tragedy. The way he harnessed the power of terrain, weather, and strategy to rise from a Corsican outsider to Emperor of France is the stuff of legend. Yet, as his empire expanded, so too did the reach of nature's hand. No matter how hard Napoleon tried to plan, how much he studied battlefields or terrain, there were always forces at work that he could not control. The weather, whether it was the harsh heat of Egypt, the freezing Russian winter, or the damp, muddy fields of Waterloo, was always there, lurking in the background, ready to intervene in ways that Napoleon couldn't predict or influence. These moments, when nature shifted the course of his empire, highlight the inherent fragility of any human endeavor. Even Napoleon, for all his military genius and ambition, was ultimately vulnerable to the same forces that affect us all: time, environment, and nature. It is important to note that Napoleon's relationship with nature was not all one of failure. He won victories in difficult climates, outwitted enemies with his understanding of terrain, and even used the weather to his advantage at times. Yet, as his empire grew, so too did the challenges he faced. As we look back on his campaigns, we can see that it wasn't just his military acumen that allowed him to achieve greatness, but also his ability to understand and adapt to the natural world around him. However, by the time of his failed Russian campaign in 1812 and his ultimate defeat at Waterloo in 1815, it was clear that nature had turned against him. The very elements that he had once mastered became his undoing. The Russian winter, which he had underestimated, decimated his army and shattered his ambitions. The muddy fields of Waterloo, which impeded his cavalry, sealed his defeat. And the isolation of St. Helena, with its damp climate and isolation, slowly wore away his health, proving that nature's grip on him remained even in exile. Even today, Napoleon's story is a potent reminder of the power of nature. We study his life not just for the lessons on leadership and strategy, but also for the insight it provides into the limits of human control. We can conquer territories, command armies, and rise to great heights, but ultimately, we must all submit to nature's will. Napoleon, for all his brilliance, was unable to escape that truth. Napoleon's final exile on the remote island of St. Helena mirrors the last stage of his empire, isolated, at the mercy of the elements, and slowly fading away. Surrounded by the same forces that had once dictated his empire's victories and losses, he spent his final years contemplating a life spent trying to shape the world, and ultimately being shaped by it. The very weather that had once aided his success now became a reminder of what he could never truly control. In the end, Napoleon's story is not just one of empire building and warfare, it's a reflection of the human condition. It speaks to our drive to control our environment, to shape our destiny, but also to the reality that, no matter how much power we wield, there will always be forces beyond our reach. The weather, in all its forms, rain, snow, sun, and wind, was a constant force in Napoleon's life, a force that he could not defeat, no matter how brilliant his strategies. Napoleon's legacy, shaped by both his brilliance and his inability to master the natural world, serves as a powerful lesson for generations to come. It reminds us that, in the grand scheme of history, we are all at the mercy of nature's unpredictable hand. And while we may strive for greatness, we must also understand that some forces are beyond our control. With that, we close the final chapter of Napoleon's story, a tale of ambition, brilliance, failure, and ultimately, the undeniable power of nature.